Hey, what's up, everyone? Today I'm going to be doing one of my favorite things, which is taking a piece of material that I've been working on for year after year after year and finally pulling the trigger on turning it into a bonsai, or at least taking the first step in terms of putting it into a bonsai pot and calling it finished. I've busted out my auxiliary turntable, and because I know that I'm going to make a big angle change on this, first I'm going to wrap the soil so I don't get it all over the place, because I'm not going to repot this probably for a couple of months yet. And so I want to kind of just stabilize this before I tip it on its side. This piece of material is among a batch of trees that I started from cutting about 7 years ago. And originally, this was a juniper cutting that I kind of wrapped around a rock. And the rock sat right in this space. And my original plan had been for this to be an exposed root or root over rock juniper, but root over rock junipers don't always work out. And what ended up happening here is that the original base was the original base of the cutting was somewhere up in here, and I had taken a root over the front of the rock, and that root ended up dying pretty soon after I tried to wrap it over the rock. And what had ended up happening was I only then had a root over on one side of the rock, so it didn't actually grab the rock. So then my next attempt was basically to wrap the trunk of the tree around the rock, which is how it got this kind of shape that we're looking at. And that didn't really work either, because I put some shari on the outside of the trunk, and meanwhile all of that lifeline that's on the inside was kind of pushing the rock away. And so finally I decided, well, this is, it's been 6 years and this hasn't gripped the rock at all, so maybe I'll just take the rock out. Because what I was seeing was that with the rock in here, and this is the front, I wasn't seeing any shari, and now all of a sudden the piece of material had a lot of interest in it that I wasn't going to be taking advantage of. So that's sort of ultimately what made me decide to change my mind. And so I picked up the tree and I was just sort of rotating it, as I do when I'm thinking about changing a design, or when I'm thinking about design in general. So I'm rotating the tree, back and forth like this, and tilting it like this, and there's some interesting stuff going on here. This large root here that's kind of winding along the surface of the soil actually has a shari on it from a time when I tried to pull some bark off of this section of the trunk. It pulled straight down onto that root. The root was wrapping underneath the rock, and I thought that's why I left this root to see if I could get the rock to get pinned between the trunk and that root. That didn't quite work out. So my new plan is to basically turn this into a cascade. So I'm going to try putting it at about that angle. And it looks like maybe I need to add a little bit more pallet wrap here, which I'll go ahead and do in a minute. But once I change the angle, then I can really intelligently look at the rest of the branching. So I'm going to spend some time here first getting this thing strapped down to my auxiliary turntable here, and then taking a look at making sure that the exact angle is correct for what I think is the best use of this portion of the trunk. And then I'm going to start eliminating branches in favor of making a more compact tree that then this coming winter I will start potting down into something that's more appropriately sized than this large growing container. So the foliage from this branch is kind of blocking our view of the trunk from what I've picked as the front, and the angle here might change a little bit. Whenever I'm picking a front, I am trying to find an angle that looks the most dynamic in the wood. So this has a nice curve to it. Shows off shari when they exist on junipers like this one has. And in this case, I'm trying to take into account that root that I mentioned that's over here. And then kind of also taking into account, where is the foliage going to come from? What is the structure going to be that actually creates the foliage pads that we want? So I've got plenty of foliage to work with here. I've probably got about 5 times as much foliage as I want. And so I just need to deal with removing the bits that I don't need, as well as reorienting using wire some of the pieces that I do want to keep. So I'm just going to go through that process, and in the midst of it, I may ultimately decide, to change the angle this way or change the angle, this way a little bit. And it's kind of a crazy sort of modified S shape here. So I'm actually going to try to reduce the appearance of the S slightly, maybe by hiding the bottom of it. So that might mean that I come over to the front over here rather than here, where I can see that kind of reverse S a little bit more clearly. But that could have its own downsides, and ultimately I won't know exactly what the front and exact angle are going to be until I get in here and take a look at how I have to take the roots into account when I repot it later. All right, so what I'm seeing in here is basically that I've got this whole section of the tree that's really not going to fit into the design if I'm going to keep the design really nice and compact. And that means that I will just go ahead and cut most of this off and then reduce the wood that's in here to just make gin for the final composition. And that means, that a lot of what I have over on this side right now is what ultimately is going to make the tree, while pretty much everything over here is going to be eliminated, and probably this as well. So in eliminating that, what I see immediately is that these two pieces were never wired, and so using those as gin is probably not going to be super interesting. So I'll probably peel bark off those and eliminate them. This one has been wired, so I'll leave a little bit more of it, but I'm still taking off all of the foliage. Now, as I showed right before I cut that off, and from the other angles, this is a little bit too big and strong. I'm going to leave that for now just in case I decide I need it. But this one doesn't have any interior growth because it was on the bottom, since we're looking kind of down from the top view at the moment. And so I'm going to take that off as well, and then make a little bit of a gin here as I make all these gin. Whenever you take a large chunk of a tree off, it's always good to kind of take a step back and evaluate, okay, did I just reveal something that might be more interesting than what I was looking at before? Because from this angle, we really couldn't see what was going on perfectly with the trunk before taking all of that foliage off. But the thing, even though the movement is nice and the bottom of the tree is kind of coming towards you, which is something that would be beneficial in terms of creating this cascade design, even though we have that situation, all of the shari that are on the trunk that are sort of more interesting and already starting to look aged are on this side. So rather than go the other direction, I would probably look at like rotating this slightly so that this portion is going back, and then this is coming slightly forward. Now it's going back again to get to all of this foliage, but then I can bring the foliage down and forward again to kind of complete the cascading design. So I'll go ahead and work on that next. All right, I've got a nice tight little pad formed down here, and this being kind of the bottom branch with the tree in this orientation, that's the branch that I want to come down to form the bottom pad. I don't want to bring this branch, which is considerably longer, down below that branch, just because from a hierarchy standpoint it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That being said, that makes this branch a little bit of a problem in terms of where to put it for the design. So I'm gonna first, so I positioned this one first just to make sure that I kind of understood where my baseline is. Now I'm going to take this one that's sort of a back branch, and I'm going to kind of intertwine it here with the deadwood that I created back here in order to create some more depth. And ultimately, I don't want all of this length that this branch has right now, but I'm not going to cut it off quite yet. Once you have the angle set on the branch, it's not quite working because there's too much deadwood in the way. Once you have the angle set on the branch, you can pull off the foliage that ends up on the bottom. But as you just saw me do, sometimes it makes, if you end up with a lot of foliage on the bottom, that's probably because the branch got twisted around in the process of creating your pads, and so all of the foliage that should have been on the top ended up on the bottom. So just use the wire to twist the branch back around, and it's best to twist in the direction that tightens the wire typically, so otherwise the wire can become more dysfunctional. So all of this bending that I'm doing right now, I'm doing from the side of the plant. In other words, I'm not looking from the front view, so it's very possible that I will have to go back and sort of undo a lot of what I'm doing right now if it doesn't look right from the front view. And for the time being, it's just kind of lost between some of the other branches. So there's a couple of different options here. One is this could come up and just become the entire top with all of these branches being ginned and putting the top about, the top of the foliage about where this sort of junction is right here. And that looks like a pretty interesting and attractive possibility to me, because this branch and this branch are coming out of this section right here at the same place as this section that's going up to what is the rest of the foliage on the composition. And so if I eliminate all of this, then I only have a double, two branches coming out of one place instead of three. On junipers, that might not be super important, but the other thing that this is going to do is it's going to allow me to give myself more room in building the structure of the crown to keep the structure, or to keep the top of the foliage below this portion of the tree, which I definitely want to do. I don't want the foliage to be all the way up here. I want to keep it kind of more down at this level. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate pretty much this whole thing. I think I'm going to leave a little bit of the wood though. So as a gin that has some nice interest and movement in it, so I'm going to leave it. I'll come back after it's dried, and the same thing with these guys down here, and just break off the actual cut points and leave sort of a more ragged looking piece of wood, and most likely this will be sticking up over the top of the crown by the time I'm finished, or at least hopefully. So this guy is kind of hanging out way back here. I'm first going to tweak this to become the top, and then figure out where this is going, and then I'll come back and see if I can tighten this up to the rest of the foliage. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this, and as you can see, eliminating this leaves a nice gin that sort of matches some of the shari that are going on here. And I've created kind of a top here. It'll fill in the middle, and ultimately it'll be a fight to keep it down away from enveloping this, but that'll take a couple of years. And then I've also created a lower branch here and essentially a back branch. So it's a very simple design in terms of the foliage, 1, 2, 3. And if I rotate this a little bit, you can see that the crown is kind of heading forward, and the back branch is kind of heading almost straight back with a little bit of, there's a little bit of a fan shape here, which you want to try to achieve whenever you're working with foliage for that real nice three-dimensional look. So like I said, pretty happy with that. It'll be later this winter or even into spring when I actually go ahead and repot this at this angle and into a bonsai pot. It might not be the final bonsai pot when I go ahead and do it, but it'll be a lot closer than this big growing container. So thanks everyone, and like and subscribe the videos if you are enjoying the content, and see you next time.